James stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest, every second stretching into eternity as he waited for his bride. The grand ballroom was decorated with the finest white roses, chandeliers sparkling like the stars, and the most powerful people in the city watching in anticipation. This was supposed to be the wedding of the century, a billionaire marrying the woman he loved, a fairy tale moment. But something was wrong. The whispers started when the priest cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting his gaze toward the entrance. The string quartet played on, but the music did nothing to mask the unease growing in the air. James's best man nudged him, but he barely noticed. He was too busy staring at the space where his bride should have been. Where was she? His fiancée, Emily, was supposed to walk down that aisle any second now, but there was no sign of her. The murmurs turned into concerned glances, then outright confusion. James clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. Something wasn't right. Then the doors burst open. But it wasn't Emily. It was her best friend, running down the aisle, out of breath, her face pale. "She's gone!" she gasped. The words hit James like a wrecking ball. The room fell into stunned silence. Gone? What did she mean, gone? His mind raced, his pulse thundering in his ears. No, this had to be a mistake. Emily wouldn't just leave him. Not like this. Not today. But as he turned toward his mother, her face told him everything. She already knew. He stormed out of the ballroom, tearing through the luxurious halls of the five-star hotel, past stunned guests, ignoring the cameras that had gathered outside. His security team trailed behind him, but he didn't care. He had one mission: find Emily. He dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. His car screeched to a halt in front of her apartment, but when he stormed inside, it was empty, completely cleared out. Drawers emptied, closet bare, not a single trace of her left behind. She was gone, vanished like a ghost. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the dresser, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had given her everything, his heart, his trust, his entire world. And she had walked away without a word. Rage replaced the shock, burning through him like wildfire. He had been humiliated in front of thousands, abandoned at the altar like some fool. He grabbed the nearest object, a framed picture of them, laughing, so in love, and hurled it across the room. The glass shattered against the wall, just like the illusion of their perfect love. Hours passed, but the pain didn't fade. It only grew. The news had already spread like wildfire. Billionaire James Sinclair left at the altar. The headlines were everywhere, the scandal dominating every social media platform, every gossip site. The public was ruthless. The woman who had won the heart of one of the wealthiest men in the country had run away like a coward. Everyone wanted answers, but James had none. Days turned into weeks, and still, no word from Emily. His team searched for her, but she had disappeared without a trace. It was as if she had never existed. That night haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that empty aisle, heard the whispers, felt the crushing humiliation. But more than anything, he felt the betrayal. He had loved her. He would have given her the world. But she had chosen to run. And from that moment on, James Sinclair swore he would never let himself be that vulnerable again. Love was a weakness, and he would never be weak again. Emily had vanished into the night like a whisper in the wind, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. The glittering world of billionaires, grand mansions, and extravagant parties had once been hers, but now she was nothing more than a shadow, lost in the chaos of the real world. With nothing but a single suitcase, and a heart weighed down by regret, she had boarded a last-minute bus out of town, her wedding dress stuffed into a trash bag, discarded like a painful memory she wished she could erase. Every mile that passed took her further from James, further from the life of luxury she had abandoned, and deeper into the unknown. She had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming need to disappear. When the bus finally came to a stop in a small town far from the flashing cameras and relentless reporters, Emily stepped off with trembling hands and an empty wallet. The little money she had stolen from her wedding fund wouldn't last long, and the harsh reality of survival settled in quickly. There were no more designer clothes, no more personal drivers, no more credit cards with limitless funds. She was no longer the woman who had once been engaged to a billionaire. She was just another nameless, struggling soul trying to make it through the day. She found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind that smelled of mildew and desperation, and handed over the last few bills she had for a week's stay. The room was small, barely big enough for a bed and a rickety dresser, but it was a roof over her head, and for now, that was enough. That first night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence suffocating. She could still hear James's voice in her head, could still see the hurt in his eyes when she had made the cruelest decision of her life. But there was no going back now. The morning came too soon, and with it, the terrifying realization that she had to find work, something she had never done before. Her entire life she had been cared for, provided for. She had lived in mansions, attended elite schools, and dined at five-star restaurants. Now, she stood in a dusty gas station, filling out a job application with shaking hands, pretending she knew what it meant to work for a living. The manager, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a skeptical expression, glanced over her resume, or lack thereof, and sighed. "Have you ever worked a cash register before?" Emily swallowed hard and shook her head. "No, but I can learn." The woman hesitated before finally sliding her a uniform. "Be here tomorrow at 6 a.m., no excuses." The uniform was 2 sizes too big, the fabric scratchy against her skin, but it didn't matter. She had a job, a way to survive. Days turned into weeks, and Emily adapted to a life she had never imagined for herself. She learned to count change, to mop floors, to deal with impatient customers who barely spared her a glance. No one in this town knew who she was. To them, she was just another struggling woman trying to get by. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to earn every dollar. But the past had a way of creeping in when she least expected it. Every time she saw a sleek black car pass by, her heart would hammer in her chest, terrified that James had found her. Every time she heard a voice that sounded like his, she would freeze, caught between hope and fear. At night, she would dream of him, of the way he had held her, the way he had looked at her with so much love, the way she had shattered him when she had walked away. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she had left because she had no choice. But the truth was, she had been afraid of being swallowed by his world, afraid of losing herself in the wealth and expectations that came with being his wife. So she had run, and now she was alone. The loneliness was the hardest part. The quiet moments when she had no one to talk to, no one to confide in. She had cut off everyone, her family, her friends, anyone who could lead James to her. There were nights when she would scroll through old messages, her finger hovering over his name, tempted to send a single text, just to know if he still thought of her. But she never did. She couldn't. She had chosen this life, and she had to live with it. One night, as she stood behind the counter of the gas station, wiping down the register for the 100th time, the bell above the door jingled. She barely looked up, too exhausted to care, until she heard a deep, familiar voice ask, "Do you have change for 100?" Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't James. But for a split second, her heart had betrayed her, hoping it was. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. This was her life now. A life of minimum wage paychecks, of aching feet, of living in fear that one day James would find her. And if he ever did, she wasn't sure whether she would beg for forgiveness or run all over again. James stood at the altar, his breath caught in his chest as the whispers in the grand cathedral turned into a deafening roar. The bride was gone. Emily had run. The love of his life, the woman he had promised to cherish forever, had left him humiliated in front of hundreds of elite guests, family members, and reporters who had been waiting to cover the wedding of the year. His hands clenched into fists as the reality sank in. She wasn't late. She wasn't lost. She had chosen to leave him. For a few agonizing moments he stood frozen, staring at the empty aisle where she should have been walking toward him, in her elegant white dress, with those uncertain yet beautiful eyes that had always made him weak. The murmurs around him grew louder, filled with speculation, pity, and worst of all, amusement. He could hear the mocking laughter of the guests who never truly believed in their love, the ones who always thought she wasn't fit for his world. And now, they were proven right. The man who had everything, money, power, status, had just been abandoned like he was nothing. The humiliation burned through his veins, igniting something dark within him. Without a word, he turned and walked out, past the shocked faces, past the flashing cameras, past the questions that stabbed like knives. His heart was breaking, but he refused to let them see. That night, he sat in his penthouse, staring at the untouched wedding ring on the table. It should have been on her finger. They should have been together, wrapped in the bliss of their wedding night. Instead, he was alone, drowning in whiskey, his mind replaying every moment he had spent with her, searching for the signs he had missed. Had she ever truly loved him? Had she been planning this all along? The James that had once believed in love, in forever, in fairy tales, died that night, and in his place, a colder, more ruthless man was born. If she wanted to run, then fine. She had made her choice. And now, so would he. Love was nothing but a weakness, a cruel illusion that left even the strongest men broken. He had been a fool to believe in it, to think that love could ever be more powerful than money, than control, than power. Never again. From that moment on, he vowed never to let himself feel that kind of pain again. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire groom left at the altar. Runaway bride shocks high society. Was it love or just a gold-digging scheme? James didn't respond. He didn't give interviews. He didn't even try to find her. If she wanted to disappear, then so be it. But she had underestimated him if she thought he would sit around mourning like a heartbroken fool. He would rebuild himself, stronger than ever. The world would never see his pain. They would only see his rise. He buried himself in work, taking over new companies, expanding his empire until there wasn't a single industry left untouched by his name. He became ruthless, feared, and untouchable. His deals were sharper, his decisions colder. He built walls so high that no one could ever reach the part of him that still ached for her. Women came and went, all beautiful, all willing, but none of them meant anything. They were distractions, nothing more. His heart was locked away, frozen in time, stuck in the moment she had walked away. But no matter how much power he gained, how many millions he made, how many nights he spent with strangers who tried to make him forget, nothing could erase her. Emily was his one failure, the one scar that never faded. And deep down, no matter how much he tried to deny it, he wanted revenge. Not in the form of public humiliation or petty games, but something far greater. He wanted to be so successful, so untouchable, that when she finally saw him again, she would realize what she had lost. She would regret every second she had spent away from him. She would beg to rewrite history, but by then it would be too late. At least, that's what he told himself. Until the night he stepped into a sleek black car, on his way to yet another meeting, and locked eyes with a familiar face in the rearview mirror. The woman sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel like she wanted to disappear, was Emily, his runaway bride. The woman who had left him was shattered, and for the first time in years, James felt something other than numbness. He felt fire, and this time he wasn't going to let her run. As James stepped out of the luxurious high-rise building, the cool evening air hit him, reminding him that no matter how high he climbed, the city still held its unpredictable twists. He wasn't in a rush tonight, but the meeting had left him with that familiar gnawing feeling of discontent. Even with his billions, there was always something missing, something more elusive than any business deal or acquisition. Love, he thought bitterly. It wasn't even worth chasing anymore. He could have any woman he wanted. He had proven that time and again. But none of them mattered. They didn't carry the same warmth, the same excitement, the same depth he once shared with Emily. Or so he'd convinced himself. After a long day of meetings, his mind was clouded, and he needed to clear it. A taxi was his preferred choice when he wanted to escape the suffocating attention of his chauffeur-driven cars. He needed anonymity. He hailed a cab and got into the back, expecting the usual faceless driver to take him to his penthouse. But as soon as the door shut, the world shifted. The driver turned slightly, and James was hit with a wave of recognition. His heart skipped a beat. The woman behind the wheel was none other than Emily. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. The woman who had broken his heart was now behind the wheel of a taxi, driving the same man she had once left at the altar. The irony was almost too much to bear. He leaned forward, not sure if he was seeing things, but the face staring back at him was unmistakable. It was her. She hadn't changed much. Still as strikingly beautiful, though now there was a weariness in her eyes. Something different. Something that made him wonder what had happened to her over the years. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Emily, on the other hand, looked taken aback for just a moment, before she quickly masked her surprise with a neutral expression. She looked into the rearview mirror, but didn't speak. James was speechless too, caught between anger, confusion, and something deeper. Something raw that had been buried for years. "Where to?" Emily asked in a quiet, almost strained voice, as if their past wasn't even worth acknowledging. James took a moment to collect his thoughts. He could demand an explanation. He could ask why she had left him, why she had chosen to walk away from everything they had. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he gave her the address to his penthouse, and for the rest of the ride, silence filled the air between them. It was a silence that spoke volumes. He could feel the tension, the unresolved history, the weight of everything that had happened between them. James watched her in the rearview mirror, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened to Emily. She wasn't the same carefree woman who had walked out of his life all those years ago. There was a heaviness to her now, a quiet strength that wasn't there before. She had survived, somehow. But how? What had she been through? How did she go from the woman he once adored to a taxi driver living in the shadows of her past? It was the first time in years that he felt that familiar spark of curiosity about her, but he couldn't bring himself to ask her about it, not yet. He wasn't ready to hear her story, not in this moment. He wasn't ready to expose the raw wound that still festered inside him, the one she had created. When they arrived at his penthouse, James hesitated before stepping out of the cab. He paid her without saying a word, but he didn't leave immediately. Emily seemed to be waiting for something too. She glanced at him one last time, as if expecting him to say something, anything, to break the silence. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked into the building, leaving her standing there in the car, just like the first time she had left him alone. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. He had spent years building his empire, pushing his emotions aside, refusing to let anything from his past affect him. But Emily's reappearance, in such an unexpected and painful way, had shaken him. He knew he couldn't ignore it. Their story wasn't finished. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. He had spent years telling himself he had no more feelings for her, that her leaving him was a blessing, but in the back of his mind, he had always known the truth. He wasn't over her. And as much as it pained him to admit it, part of him still wanted to know why she had run away. What had happened to her after that day? Why had she chosen this life? This quiet, lonely existence as a taxi driver? The answers were out there, and he was determined to get them, even if it meant confronting everything he had buried deep inside. The next day, James found himself in the back of another taxi. The same one. But this time, he wasn't just another passenger. He was on a mission. He couldn't let this go. Not again. James couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of déjà vu as he stepped into the taxi once again. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Emily, the woman who had once been the love of his life, the woman who had disappeared from his world without a trace. Now, she was back, but not in the way he had ever expected. He had tried to push her out of his thoughts for years, but the moment he had laid eyes on her again, everything had changed. She was different, yes. But there was no mistaking her face, her eyes, the way her presence had once captivated him. He didn't need any more confirmation. It was her. This time, when he climbed into the back seat, the tension in the air was palpable. Emily was trying hard to maintain her composure, her grip tight on the steering wheel. But he could sense the unease in her. Her face was blank, but there was something in the way she avoided looking at him in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. James leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest as his thoughts raced. He knew he couldn't let her pretend that nothing had ever happened between them. He wasn't just some random passenger. He was the man she had left behind, the one she had promised to love, and then discarded. He had spent years trying to erase the pain of her betrayal, but now that she was in front of him, he couldn't ignore the raw emotions that had resurfaced. She had tried to hide behind the disguise of a taxi driver, attempting to bury her past and start anew. But James wasn't stupid. He knew it was her. How could he forget? How could he not recognize the woman who had shattered his heart into a million pieces? "Where to?" Emily asked, her voice strained but steady, as though trying to keep the conversation as businesslike as possible. James stared at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes piercing into hers. She flinched slightly, but he saw the flicker of recognition in her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in the suffocating silence of the taxi. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You know exactly who I am. Don't pretend like you don't." Emily's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and for the briefest second, he saw a flicker of panic. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She cleared her throat and straightened up, trying to regain control. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice now colder, more distant. "I'm just a taxi driver. I don't know you." James wasn't buying it. He knew her better than she realized. He had loved her with all his heart, and that kind of connection didn't just disappear. There was no way that the woman who had run away from him at the altar could now deny that she was the same person. It wasn't just the face. It was the way she moved, the way she spoke, even the way she held herself. "I'm not going to let you hide behind this new identity," James said, his tone unwavering. "You may think you've left everything behind, but you haven't. You can't just erase the past." For a long moment, Emily didn't answer. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She was trying to keep it together, but James could see the cracks beginning to show. He wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the situation or the weight of the emotions she had been carrying for years, but she was no longer as composed as she had been when they first met. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to leave. You have to believe me, James. I didn't want any of this. But it was the only way. The only way I could be free." James's heart clenched as he listened to her words. She didn't sound like the confident woman he had once known. She sounded broken, and that broke him even more. The woman he had loved, the woman who had once filled his life with so much hope and promise, had been hiding all this time, running from a past that she couldn't escape. He felt a pang of sympathy, but it wasn't enough to erase the bitterness that had built up over the years. "Why didn't you tell me, Emily?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you give us a chance to figure it out together?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Emily's face softened for just a moment, but then she looked away, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I was scared," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to tell you that I had to leave everything behind to survive. James felt a surge of anger rise within him. You could have trusted me, he said, his voice rising. You could have trusted that I would have understood. She shook her head, her eyes glassy. You didn't understand. You never did. You were always focused on your business, on your wealth. I couldn't compete with that, James. I couldn't be just another thing you owned. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. For years he had told himself that it was all her fault, that she was the one who had abandoned him. But now, hearing her side of the story, he realized that he had never really understood her. He had never truly listened to her. He had been so focused on his pain that he had failed to see the emotional toll their relationship had taken on her. For the first time, James felt like he was the one who had been blind. He had blamed her for everything, but he had never taken the time to understand why she had done what she had done. He had never tried to see it from her perspective. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like hours, and James couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment that everything had changed. They had both been living in a world of their own, nursing old wounds and blaming each other for the past. But now, for the first time in years, they were face to face with the truth about what had happened between them. James wanted to say something, anything, to make things right. But he didn't know where to start. He had spent so long convincing himself that he hated her, that he had moved on. But now he realized that nothing had changed. The love he had for her was still there, buried deep beneath the layers of anger and resentment. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start healing. James couldn't believe what was happening. After years of trying to bury the past, Emily was back in his life. He had never expected to see her again, much less in this strange and unexpected way. She had tried to hide who she was, but the moment their eyes met, everything changed. He knew now that his unresolved feelings for her were impossible to ignore. She had left him at the altar without a word, and he had spent years trying to forget her. But now, fate had brought her back, and there was no escaping it. The bitterness in him flared up once more, but so did the deep ache in his heart. He couldn't just let her slip away again. This time, he would make her stay, whether she liked it or not. As the taxi ride continued, the tension between them was almost unbearable. Emily was trying to act as though this was just another ordinary transaction, but James wasn't buying it. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers through the rearview mirror. He could see her discomfort, but it only made him more determined to confront her, to make her face what they both had been running from for years. "Why did you leave, Emily?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Why run away from everything we had? From me?" Emily's hands trembled on the steering wheel, her eyes flicking to the side as if searching for an escape from the truth. She didn't answer him right away, but James wasn't going to let it go. "You left without a word. You disappeared like I meant nothing to you." He could see her jaw tighten, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She wasn't ready to talk about it, but James was done with the silence. He had to get to the heart of it. "You owe me an explanation, Emily. I'm not letting this go." Emily bit her lip, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She had been trying so hard to move on, to escape the life she had once known. But now, facing him again, all of her old fears resurfaced. She wasn't ready to confront it all. But James wasn't about to let her off the hook. "I know you've been running away from the past, but we need to settle this. You don't get to just walk away anymore," he said, his voice cold, but with an underlying edge of vulnerability that he had tried to bury for so long. "I won't let you ruin me again." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She knew he was right. She had abandoned him, left him with nothing but a broken heart and unanswered questions. But now, after all this time, facing him again was far more difficult than she had ever imagined. "James," she started, but her voice trailed off, the words lost in the rush of emotions that swirled inside her. He wasn't having it. "I need an answer from you. I'm not asking for your love, but I'm done being left in the dark. So here's what's going to happen. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of determination flashing across his face. You're going to make things right. I'm going to make sure you face the consequences of what you did. Emily's heart raced, her palms growing clammy on the steering wheel. She had never seen this side of James before, the angry, cold side that seemed so far removed from the man she had once known. She could tell that he was serious, that he wasn't going to back down. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. James sat back in the seat, a slow smile creeping onto his lips. "I want to make a deal with you, Emily. You and we're going to settle this. You'll owe me for everything you took from me, and you're going to work for me. I'll set the terms, and you'll have no choice but to accept them." Emily's mind raced. This was the last thing she wanted, being caught in some kind of power struggle with him again. But the look in his eyes told her that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a demand. "What do you want from me?" James leaned forward again, his gaze hard and unwavering. "You're going to work for me. No excuses. You'll help me with the new venture I'm launching, and you'll make up for the years I lost because of you. You'll answer to me, and you'll follow my every order. It's the least you can do." Her stomach twisted in knots at his words, but Emily knew there was no escape. The way he was speaking, cold and detached, reminded her of how he had been after she left. He had been broken, but now he was determined to make her pay for it. And the worst part was, she couldn't argue with him. She owed him everything. She had left him at his most vulnerable, without a second thought, and now she was going to have to face the consequences of her actions. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she asked, her voice barely audible, as though she was resigned to the fate he had chosen for them both. James smiled coldly, the kind of smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't have a choice. You'll do exactly what I say. And maybe, just maybe, when you've paid your debt, we'll see where things go." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of the deal hanging heavily in the air. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. She had walked away from him once, thinking she could escape everything. But now, it seemed like the past had caught up with her, and there was no running away this time. She didn't know if she should be relieved or terrified. But one thing was certain. She had a lot of work to do to make amends for the mistakes of the past. And this time, there was no turning back. She had tried so hard to build a new life, to escape everything that tied her to James. But the universe seemed to have other plans. The moment he forced her back into his world, she felt the familiar pull of emotions she had long buried. He had once been her everything, the man she had loved deeply, the man who had swept her off her feet with his ambition, kindness, and charm. But now, after everything that had happened, after the betrayal, after walking away from the life he had offered her, everything felt different. The coldness in his eyes, the arrogance in his posture, it all screamed of the pain he had endured because of her. Still, there was something there that couldn't be ignored. She had never stopped loving him, not entirely. As much as she had tried to bury those feelings, they still lived within her, lurking beneath the surface. But that didn't change the fact that she had hurt him in the worst way possible. She couldn't forgive herself for what she'd done, and she couldn't expect him to either. Yet despite the animosity between them, she couldn't deny the way her heart raced whenever he entered a room. The way his presence seemed to stir something deep inside her. She hated it. Hated that after everything, the spark between them was still there, like an ember that wouldn't go out, no matter how hard she tried to put it out. He had made it clear that he didn't need her, that he had moved on, and yet, as they spent more time together, the old tension began to resurface. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, where she would catch him looking at her with a softness she hadn't seen in years, and it would send her heart into a frenzy. Was he remembering the same things she was? Was he feeling the same ache in his chest when their eyes met across a room, or when their hands accidentally brushed against each other? She hated how much she wanted to believe that there was a chance for them, but she knew better. He had built walls around his heart, walls that she had put there herself. The man he had become was far from the one she had known, the kind, loving, gentle man who had offered her everything. Now he was distant, cold, and calculating, a man who had learned to live without love. Yet there was still something in the way he interacted with her that made her question everything. His gestures were sometimes softer than they should have been. His words were sharper. But there was an underlying current of care that he couldn't hide. It was as though he was still trying to figure out how to balance the man he had become with the man he had once been. She couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere deep down, he was still the man she had fallen in love with. But there was so much hurt between them now. So many unresolved emotions. So many unanswered questions. Could they ever go back to what they once had? She didn't think so. She had resisted this. Resisted him. Because she couldn't face the truth. She couldn't bear to open herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. Not after everything she had been through. But now, in his presence, all her defenses seemed to crumble. The walls she had built to protect herself were slowly but surely being chipped away, piece by piece. She couldn't fight it anymore. Her feelings were resurfacing, stronger than ever. And the worst part was, she didn't know how to deal with it. She had to keep reminding herself that this was the man who had been cold to her, who had put her through hell after she had left him. He didn't deserve her love, not now, not after everything. She had left him once, and though she regretted it every day, she couldn't go back. Couldn't undo the damage, but it didn't stop the desire, the yearning she felt when she saw him standing there, so close, so near, yet so far away. His world was one she no longer belonged to. He had changed, and so had she. But their past was never far behind, lingering like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. Every interaction between them seemed to bring the past rushing back. Every smile, every word, every glance. She could feel the pull, the magnetic force drawing her in, and she knew it wasn't just him. It was her too. But the more she resisted, the stronger the force became. She couldn't keep pretending that she didn't care, that she didn't want him. Deep down, she knew that she still loved him, despite everything, despite the anger, despite the betrayal. And that terrified her. She wasn't ready to let go of the life she had built for herself. But how could she ignore the truth? How could she deny the connection they once shared, the love that still burned brightly within her? As the days went on, the tension between them only grew. She knew it, and so did he. They both felt it. The unspoken tension. The electric charge that hung between them every time they were near each other. But no matter how much they fought it, no matter how hard they tried to keep their distance, the truth remained. Their feelings for each other had never really gone away, and as much as she tried to keep her emotions in check, she knew that sooner or later they would have to confront what was happening between them. They couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. She just hoped, for both their sakes, that they were strong enough to face the truth without destroying everything they had left. Because the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that the hardest part of all this wasn't the anger, the betrayal, or the hurt. It was the fact that she still loved him. And that love was starting to seep back into everything she did. Everything she felt. It was only a matter of time before they both had to face it. She had run away from him, and for years the reason behind her escape remained hidden, buried beneath layers of pain and pride. James never truly understood why she had left him, why she had walked out of his life without a word, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered trust. He had assumed it was because of his wealth, his family's expectations, or perhaps the coldness he had shown her in his pursuit of success. But he never could have guessed the truth. It wasn't about his money or his status. It was about something far more painful, something she had never been able to share with him. The truth behind her escape was a secret that weighed heavily on her heart, a secret she had kept hidden from everyone, even him. For years she had told herself that leaving was the only way to protect him, to protect them both. But now, In the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think about it, she knew she had been running from herself as much as she had been running from him. The truth was, she had been terrified. Terrified of the life she was being forced into. Terrified of the future he had promised her. A future she wasn't sure she could live with. She hadn't left because she didn't love him. Far from it. She had left because she loved him too much. She had been swallowed up by the expectations that came with being the billionaire's fiancée. The pressure to conform to a life she wasn't ready for. A life that felt like a gilded cage. She had been expected to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman. But beneath all the luxury and the opulence, she had felt suffocated, lost in a world where her own desires and dreams had no place. The weight of those expectations had driven her to the breaking point, and when she had felt like she couldn't breathe anymore, she had run. But it wasn't just the pressure that had driven her away. It was the fear of losing herself in a world where she would always be defined by the man she married. She had seen it happen before. Women who became shadows of themselves, their identities swallowed up by their husband's wealth and power. She had never wanted that. She had wanted to keep her independence, her sense of self. But the more time she spent in his world, the more she realized that was a luxury she couldn't afford. She hadn't known how to tell him that. She hadn't known how to explain that her need to escape wasn't because of him, but because of everything around them. The life they were building together, the life he wanted for her, was not the life she had dreamed of. But she couldn't explain that to him. Not then. She had been too scared, too ashamed of her own feelings. So, she had left. And now, years later, as they stood face to face once again, she could see the hurt in his eyes, the anger, the betrayal that still lingered between them. He had never understood why she left, and she had never been able to give him an answer. Until now. As the truth finally began to spill out, piece by piece, she realized just how much damage her silence had caused. She had never meant to hurt him, but in her attempt to protect herself, she had hurt them both. The walls she had built around her heart were slowly crumbling, and with each word, each revelation, the gap between them seemed to grow wider. She had run to escape a future she wasn't ready for, but in doing so, she had destroyed the future they could have had together. Now, as she faced him once again, the man she had once loved with all her heart, she knew there was no going back. The truth had come to light, but the damage had already been done. The question now was whether they could ever rebuild what they had lost. Could they forgive each other for the past? Could they find a way to move forward, despite the pain and the betrayal? She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing. The truth had finally come to light, and there was no hiding from it anymore. The only question that remained was whether they could find a way to move forward, or if the past would always stand between them, a barrier they could never cross. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, like a storm ready to break. Standing there, looking at her, James could feel the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Hurt, anger, betrayal. But also something deeper, something more complicated. His heart still ached from the day she had left him at the altar, the day she had walked away from the life they could have had. He had spent years trying to move on, trying to bury the memories of her. But seeing her again, after all this time, had opened a floodgate of emotions he didn't know how to deal with. She was standing right in front of him, and she had no idea what kind of power he held over her now. She had no idea of the wealth, the resources, or the connections he had accumulated since their last meeting. He was no longer the same man he had been back then. He was a billionaire, a man who had built his empire from nothing, a man who had learned to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. His name carried weight now, his decisions had consequences, and she, standing in front of him, was just another part of the past that he could manipulate if he so wished. He could use his power to punish her, to make her feel the pain he had felt when she had abandoned him. He could use his influence to ruin her, to make her regret ever walking away from him. The thought tempted him, but even as he considered it, something inside him fought against it. The anger he felt was raw, But it wasn't the same as it had been all those years ago. Now, there was something else in his heart. A conflict. A pull between the desire for revenge and the remnants of the love he had once felt for her. Could he really punish her for making the choice she had? Could he really bring himself to destroy her, knowing that it was partly his fault too? He had been cold, distant, and absorbed in his own world back then, never understanding her struggles, never seeing the person she had been beyond his expectations of her. She had never been just the girl he wanted to marry for the sake of status. She was a person with her own dreams, fears, and desires. And yet, she had left him. She had chosen to escape the life he had promised her, a life of wealth and luxury, because she had been suffocating in it. Her escape, though painful for him, had been a cry for freedom, a cry that he had ignored at the time. Now, looking at her, he realized just how much he had misunderstood her, just how little he had truly known about her. And that realization made him question whether revenge was really the right course of action. But that wasn't the only thing holding him back. There was also the knowledge that if he were to use his power against her, it would come at a great cost. Not just to her, but to him as well. The power he wielded could destroy her life, but it could also destroy the person he had become in the process. He had worked hard to build his empire, to gain the wealth and power that made him untouchable. But at what cost? Had he become so hardened, so focused on his own success, that he had forgotten what it meant to care for someone? He could punish her for running away, but he could also choose to help her. He could choose to be the man she had once loved, the man who had cared for her deeply, the man who had been ready to give her everything. Could he still be that man? Could he still love her after everything that had happened? The decision wasn't easy. He knew that whatever he chose, it would change everything between them. If he punished her, it would be the end of any hope of reconciliation. She would never forgive him, and the love they had once shared would be gone forever. But if he helped her, if he showed her that he could forgive her, that he could offer her a second chance, it could open the door to healing, not just for her, but for him too. The question was, could he let go of the bitterness, the hurt, and the anger that had festered inside him for so long? Could he choose forgiveness over revenge? The power was in his hands. He could destroy her with a single word, a single decision. But he could also save her, help her, and maybe, just maybe, find a way back to the love they had once shared. It was a decision that would shape the rest of his life and the future of their relationship. The question remained. Would he use his power to punish her, or would he choose to help her, and, in doing so, heal the wounds of the past? The weight of the years had finally caught up with her. For so long she had lived in the shadows, hiding from the past, running from the pain, from the man she had once loved but left behind. Every day had been a struggle, every moment a reminder of the life she had abandoned. The decision to leave him at the altar had never been an easy one. She had been torn, caught between her love for him and the suffocating pressure of a life she didn't want. A life of wealth and expectation that never felt like her own. She had thought that by running away, she could escape it all, escape him, escape the gilded cage that was meant to be her future. But now, here she was, facing him once again, the man who had been her everything and her nothing. The years had changed them both, but the connection between them, no matter how much she had tried to deny it, was still there, a powerful force that pulled at her heartstrings. He had become everything she had feared, a man with power and influence, someone who could destroy her with a single word. Yet even with all his wealth and success, he was still the same man who had once held her heart in his hands, the same man who had loved her so deeply, so completely. And now, she could no longer run. No more hiding, no more pretending. She had to face him, face the consequences of her actions, and face the truth of why she had left him in the first place. She had to confront the painful reality that the life she had tried so desperately to escape had caught up with her in ways she never expected. The shame, the guilt, the fear. All of it flooded her as she stood before him. A taxi driver, of all things, now faced with the billionaire she had once been so close to. The truth was undeniable. She had made choices that had led her to this moment, and now she had to own up to them. She couldn't hide behind her fears anymore. She couldn't run from the truth. He had the power to destroy her, to make her pay for abandoning him. But there was something deeper, something more profound between them that she could no longer ignore. Her heart had never truly stopped loving him, despite the years of separation, despite the lies and the deception she had told herself. As he stood there, cold and unyielding, she knew she couldn't just slip away into the night again. The time had come for answers. The time had come to face him, to explain why she had made the choices she did, to make him understand her reasons. She couldn't let the years of running define her anymore. But would he listen? Would he be willing to hear her side of the story? Or would the bitterness, the resentment of the past, be too much for him to overcome? The road to forgiveness was a long one, and she knew it. It would take more than just words, more than just an apology, to make up for the years she had lost. The pain of their separation still lingered, a scar on both of their hearts, and the question now was whether they could heal together, or if their past was too broken to ever be repaired. She couldn't run anymore. She couldn't hide behind the past. And in this moment, as she stood before him, she realized that the choice was no longer his. It was hers. She had to decide if she was willing to face the consequences of her actions, if she was willing to own her mistakes, and if she was ready to accept whatever came next. Her breaking point had arrived. She had no more excuses. It was time to face the man she had once loved, to face the truth of who she was now, and to decide if there was a way forward for them. Would he accept her explanation, or would he turn his back on her for good? Would their past be enough to rebuild what they had, or would it forever remain a painful memory? The silence between them was deafening, and she knew the next words she spoke would determine everything. There was no going back. It was time to face him, once and for all. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken heaviness that hung between them as they sat in the dimly lit room. She had come this far, standing before him after all these years of running, of hiding from the truth. They had both been through so much, and yet the past was like a shadow, always looming over them, threatening to swallow them whole. She had hoped, prayed even, that this confrontation, this painful moment of reckoning, would finally offer the closure they both desperately needed. But just as she thought they were beginning to bridge the gap between their shattered hearts, a third party entered the picture. Someone neither of them had expected. It was like a bomb had been dropped in the room, shattering the fragile illusion they had begun to rebuild. The words came out, cutting through the silence, a revelation so raw, so painful, that neither of them knew how to process it. The truth, once again, was not what they had imagined. The third party, someone neither of them had considered, revealed a hidden truth that threatened to undo everything. What they thought they knew about each other, what they had believed was the cause of their pain and separation, was nothing more than a twisted lie. The revelation shook them to their core, making them question everything they had been through, everything they had endured. She looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief, trying to piece together the broken fragments of this new reality. Had he known about this? Did he hide this from her all these years? The guilt, the shame, it all rushed back. But this time, it was different. This time, the betrayal wasn't just her doing. It was a shared wound, a truth that neither of them could deny. His reaction was a mix of anger and disbelief, and she could see the walls begin to build up once again. The trust they had started to rebuild, the tentative steps toward understanding, were now crumbling beneath the weight of this new information. This was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything either of them had faced before. As the third party's words echoed in her ears, She couldn't help but wonder how long he had known, how much he had hidden from her, and why it had all come to this. The truth they had spent so many years avoiding was now staring them in the face. And it wasn't the neat, tidy narrative they had created for themselves. The pain of the betrayal was sharp, a jagged edge that sliced through the healing process. But the real question lingered. What now? How would they both move forward from this? Was there any chance for redemption? For healing? For love? Or had this revelation torn everything beyond repair? He looked at her, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. But behind it, there was something more. A flicker of uncertainty, of hurt, that mirrored her own. In that moment, they were both broken, both standing in the ruins of what they had once thought was a future. But now, they were left to confront the truth. No matter how ugly, no matter how painful, the future of their relationship was uncertain, clouded by the shock of this revelation. Would they survive this ultimate betrayal, or was this the final blow that would separate them for good? As the third party's words echoed in the silence, the weight of the moment pressed down on them both. They had no choice but to face it. No more running, no more hiding. The truth had been revealed, and now, they would have to decide what to do with it. Would they succumb to the pain of the betrayal, or would they rise above it, stronger and more united than before? The answer would determine everything. The fate of their love, their future, and everything they had worked to rebuild now hung in the balance. The atmosphere in the room was charged with an intensity neither of them could deny. It was the culmination of years of pent-up emotions, of unresolved pain, regret, and love. He stood across from her, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, as if he were trying to hold everything in. But the words were bursting, desperate to be released. She, too, felt the weight of the years pressing down on her chest, a heaviness that seemed to get worse with every passing second. The space between them was thick with the unsaid words that had been left unspoken for far too long, emotions that had festered in the silence. The moment had finally arrived, the grand confession that neither of them had been ready for, yet both had known deep down was inevitable. "I didn't want this, you know," he finally spoke, his voice low but fierce. "I didn't want to feel like this. I didn't want to need you. But here we are." His words were sharp, the bitterness in his voice undeniable. "You left me. You walked away without a second thought, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken heart. But you're back now, and I don't know if I can just forgive you." His eyes darkened, the anger and hurt mixing with something else, something more vulnerable. She could see it, the deep pain behind his cold exterior, the love that still lingered despite everything. His words cut through her, each sentence like a knife twisting deeper into the wound she had tried to heal. She had never meant to hurt him, not like this. But now, facing him, hearing the weight of his pain in his voice, the full extent of her actions hit her like a ton of bricks. She had caused him so much grief, so much heartbreak. And for what? Because of her fears, her insecurities, her doubts about their future? And yet, despite it all, here he was, standing before her, broken, angry, and still holding on to something that resembled love. The floodgates opened. She couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears she had been holding back for so long began to fall, as if they had been waiting for this moment, this confrontation, to finally let go. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it felt so small, so insignificant compared to the pain she had caused. "I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to love you properly." She wiped her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. "I ran away because I was scared. Scared of everything. Of us. Of what you meant to me. I thought I could outrun it. But I was wrong." The words were pouring out of her now, and she couldn't stop them. "I never stopped loving you, not for 1 second. But I was afraid that I wasn't enough for you. That I couldn't give you what you needed, what you deserved. And so, I ran. I'm so sorry." His expression softened for just a moment, his defenses slipping as he took a step closer to her. "You think that?" he asked quietly. That I didn't need you? That you weren't enough? The pain in his voice matched the anguish she felt inside. I needed you more than you could ever imagine. But you left, and I had to pick up the pieces of my life, pretending I didn't care when all I ever wanted was to hold you close again. She felt the weight of his words in her chest, the raw vulnerability in his voice echoing her own deepest fears. They were both trapped in this cycle of pain and regret, unable to break free from the mistakes of the past. But as he stood there before her, his eyes filled with the same longing, the same desire to move past the hurt, she realized something. Maybe this was the moment where they could finally stop running. Maybe this was the moment where the love they had both hidden for so long could finally break free, could finally heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other. She took a deep breath, her heart racing as she stepped closer to him. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice trembling. But I know that I don't want to live with this regret anymore. I want to try. I want to fight for us, for the love we had, for the love we still have. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with possibility. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. And in that moment, she saw it. The flicker of hope, the glimpse of a future where they could heal together. Slowly, he reached for her, his touch gentle, tentative at first, as if unsure if he could trust her again. But when she didn't pull away, when she met him halfway, he closed the gap between them, wrapping his arms around her. The embrace was everything. The love they had lost, the hurt they had caused, and the hope that they could rebuild it all. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a start, a chance, a beginning. Their grand confession, their release of all the pain and regret, was the first step towards healing. And though they both knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, at least they were walking it together. Love, pain, and regret had exploded in that final confrontation, but in the end, it was what would bring them back together, and with that, they could finally begin to heal. The weight of the decision hung heavily between them, each moment dragging on like an eternity. The air felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension as they both sat across from each other, lost in the turmoil of what had happened, what could have been, and what was still possible. They had come so far and faced so much, but this was the moment that would determine everything. Could they forgive each other for the pain they had caused? Could they rewrite their love story, one that had been tainted by lies, regrets, and missed opportunities? The question lingered, suspended in the silence that stretched between them. She looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of what he was feeling, what he was thinking. His expression was unreadable, the guarded look that had become so familiar to her, the mask he had worn for so long to protect himself from further heartbreak. She had hurt him. She knew that. But the question now was whether he could forgive her, whether they could rebuild what had been broken. She had been the one to run away, the one to abandon everything they had built together. She had let her fears and insecurities take control, pushing him away just when they needed each other the most. Now, she regretted every moment of it. She regretted the distance she had created, the walls she had built between them. But as she looked at him, she realized that those walls didn't have to remain. They could break them down together. I can't change what I did, she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. I can't undo the pain I caused you. But I can try to make things right. I can try to show you that I've changed, that I've learned from my mistakes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered between them, offering a gesture of hope, of reconciliation. He didn't move at first. He just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, but also something deeper, something that resembled the love he had once felt for her. He hadn't let go of it completely, even though he had tried. Even though he had convinced himself that he was better off without her, a part of him still wanted her. She could see it now, the vulnerability in his eyes, the conflict within him. He had been hurt. He had been broken. But he was still here, still willing to listen, still willing to try. Slowly, he reached for her hand, his grip firm but tentative, as if afraid that if he held on too tightly, it might all slip away again. "I've spent so long trying to hate you," he said, his voice low, the words heavy with the weight of all the years they had lost. "I've spent so long trying to convince myself that I was better off without you, that I didn't need you. But the truth is," his voice faltered for a moment, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. "The truth is, I don't know if I can live without you. I don't know if I can just forget what we had. I don't know if I can walk away from this, from us." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and for the first time in so long, there was no wall between them. No more lies, no more secrets, just the truth. He had never stopped loving her. He had never stopped hoping for a second chance. She felt her heart swell, the hope she had once lost beginning to spark again. They were here, together, facing the pain of the past. And yet, there was something in this moment that made her believe they could overcome it. She could see it in his eyes, the same love that had drawn them together in the first place. The same love that had been buried beneath the hurt but was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. "I know it's not going to be easy," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "I know we can't just go back to how things were. But we can start fresh. We can rewrite our story, one page at a time." He nodded slowly, his thumb brushing against her hand, as if testing the waters, as if unsure whether this moment was real or just another fleeting dream. "I want to believe that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to believe that we can fix this, that we can heal. But I need to know that you're really ready for that. I need to know that you won't run again, that you won't push me away when things get tough." Her heart clenched at the thought. She had hurt him in ways she couldn't even begin to explain, and now, the fear of losing him again was almost unbearable. "I won't run," she promised, her voice steady, full of conviction. "Not this time. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I want us to build something real, something strong, and I'm willing to fight for it, for us." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. He searched her face, as if looking for any trace of doubt, but all he found was sincerity. She meant every word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "Let's do it. Let's try. But this time no more running, no more lies. We face everything together." She smiled, a soft, relieved smile that spread across her face as she squeezed his hand. They had made it through the storm, and now they had the chance to rebuild, to create a new beginning. And as they sat there hand in hand, she knew that this was just the start of their new story. The past would always be there, a part of who they were, but it didn't have to define them. Together, they could rewrite their love story, one step at a time. The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow over the streets below, as she sat on the balcony, gazing out at the world that seemed so far away. It had been years since she had walked away from everything she knew, years since she had left him behind in search of something she couldn't quite understand. Now, here they were again, standing on the edge of a new beginning. But there was one thing that still held them both back. The past. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of the mistakes they had made, the hurt they had caused. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't seem to escape it. But now, as she looked out over the city, something had changed. Something inside her had shifted, and she knew that if they were going to have any chance at happiness, they would have to let go of the past. It was the only way forward. She heard the door behind her open, and she turned, her heart racing as she saw him standing there, looking as perfect as ever. He hadn't changed much in the years that had passed. He still carried himself with that same confident air, the same intensity that had drawn her to him in the first place. But there was something different about him now. Something softer, more vulnerable. He was no longer the man who had been so sure of everything, so certain that he had everything under control. Now, he was just a man who had loved and lost, and was willing to try again. She could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty, the fear of making the same mistakes, the fear of being hurt again. And yet, despite all of that, there was also a glimmer of hope, a flicker of the love they had once shared. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his voice hoarse as he stepped closer to her. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence between them stretched on for a moment, neither of them quite sure what to say. They had been down this road before, and the weight of their history was a heavy burden to carry. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, "about us, about everything that happened. I know we can't just erase the past, but I don't want to let it define us anymore. I want a future with you, a real future. But only if you're willing to try. Only if you're willing to let go of the past." She felt her heart race, a rush of emotions flooding through her. She had wanted to hear those words for so long. But now that they were finally spoken, she wasn't sure if she was ready to believe them. Could they really start over? Could they really put everything behind them and build something new? "I don't know if I can," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "The past, it's always going to be a part of us, isn't it? How do we just forget everything that's happened?" He reached out, his hand gently brushing her cheek, and for a moment she felt like the years between them had melted away. "We don't have to forget," he said softly. "We just have to stop letting it control us. We can't change what happened, but we can choose how we move forward. We can choose to let go of the anger, the hurt, and the fear, and build something better, something stronger." She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his words. It wasn't easy, not by any means. The scars of the past were still fresh, still painful, and she knew it would take time to heal. But maybe he was right. Maybe this was their second chance. Maybe this was the moment they had both been waiting for, even if they hadn't known it at the time. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked into his, seeing the raw vulnerability there, the same vulnerability she had once feared but now felt a deep connection to. "I want that," she said, her voice shaky but full of hope. "I want a future with you. But I don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything yet." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words, the fear that still gripped her heart. "We don't have to rush. We can take it slow. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'll wait for you. I'll always wait for you." And in that moment, she knew he meant it. He wasn't just saying the words to make her feel better. He was giving her the space she needed to heal, to truly forgive herself, and to let go of the past. He wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for a chance to love again. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you again. I don't want to make the same mistakes." He smiled softly, a reassuring smile that made her feel safe, even in her fear. "We'll make new mistakes," he said gently, "but we'll face them together." She smiled back, her heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't perfect, and they weren't perfect. But they were here, together, and for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Hope for the future. Hope for their love. They had both been through so much, but now, standing here in this moment, they had the opportunity to rebuild, to start fresh, and maybe, just maybe, they could make this second chance work. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm now, full of determination. Let's try. Let's do this. Together. He took her hand, his grip strong and steady. Together, he echoed. And in that moment, as they stood there, hand in hand, the past didn't seem so important anymore. What mattered was the future they would create together, one day at a time. And with that, a love was reborn. A love that was willing to face the past, let go of the pain, and build something new. If you were in his place, would you forgive her? After years of pain, betrayal, and unanswered questions, he finally had the chance to make a choice. He could hold on to the bitterness, the heartbreak, and the anger that had consumed him since the day she left. Or he could choose to let it go, to embrace the possibility of a new beginning, and take a chance on love again. But forgiveness isn't easy. It's not just about saying the words. It's about truly letting go of the past. Could you forgive someone who abandoned you at your lowest? Someone who shattered your heart without an explanation? Would you be able to trust them again, knowing they had once walked away? Or would you take the safer route, protecting yourself, keeping your heart guarded, and never allowing them close enough to hurt you again? Life doesn't give second chances often, but when it does, it's up to us to decide whether we take the risk or walk away for good. So, if you were in his place, what would you do? Would you forgive her? Would you give love another chance? Or would you let the past define your future? Tell us in the comments below.